The acrid smell of smoke and decay hung heavy in the air as Kasai crouched behind the overturned market stall, her calloused fingers gripping the makeshift spear she'd fashioned from a broken umbrella and kitchen knife. The once vibrant streets of Lagos had become a graveyard of memories, littered with abandoned cars and the shambling remnants of what used to be her neighbors. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, and the world she knew had crumbled faster than sand through desperate fingers. Beside her, Amara pressed her back against the concrete barrier, her breathing shallow and controlled. The former medical student had learned to move like a ghost through the ruins of civilization, her knowledge of human anatomy now serving a darker purpose as she identified the most efficient ways to stop the infected. Her dark eyes scanned the street ahead, calculating distances and escape routes with the precision that had once made her professors proud. "They're getting smarter," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant groans that echoed through the empty marketplace. "Look how they're moving in formation now." Kasai followed her gaze to where a group of zombies shuffled through the debris-strewn plaza. Unlike the mindless wanderers they'd encountered in the early days, these creatures moved with an unsettling coordination, their rotting heads turning in unison as they searched for prey. The virus had evolved and so had its hosts. From their hiding spot, they could see Zuberi making her way across the rooftops, her lithe form moving with the grace of a dancer despite the heavy pack strapped to her shoulders. The former acrobat had become their scout, using skills learned in circus tents to navigate the vertical landscape of the dead city. She paused at the edge of a building, raising her hand in a signal that made both women's hearts sink. More infected were coming from the north. The plan had been simple: retrieve medical supplies from the abandoned hospital and return to their sanctuary before nightfall. But nothing was simple anymore in this world where the dead refused to stay buried. Kasai touched the small pouch at her waist, feeling the precious antibiotics inside that could save Django's life. The youngest member of their group had been running a fever for 2 days, and without proper medicine, they all knew what would happen. Amara's hand found Kasai's shoulder, squeezing gently. "We can still make it," she said, though doubt flickered in her eyes. "Zuberi will create a distraction, and we'll have maybe 10 minutes to reach the hospital." The sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere behind them, followed by a low moan that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Kasai's grip tightened on her weapon as she remembered her grandmother's stories about spirits that walked between worlds, never imagining that such nightmares could become reality. But here they were, living in a world where death was no longer an ending but a transformation into something hungry and relentless. A sharp whistle cut through the air, Zuberi's signal that the path was clear. Kasai and Amara exchanged a look that spoke volumes about the bond forged in survival, then moved as one from their hiding place. Their footsteps were silent on the broken asphalt as they sprinted toward the hospital's looming silhouette, its windows dark and empty like the eye sockets of a skull. Behind them, the infected began to stir, drawn by some invisible thread to the scent of living flesh. The hunt was beginning again, as it did every day in this new world where humanity clung to existence by threads as thin as spider silk. But these women had learned to be more than survivors. They had become predators in their own right, shaped by necessity into something fierce and unbreakable. As they reached the hospital's entrance, Kasai paused to look back at the city that had raised her. Somewhere in those ruins, other groups of survivors were fighting their own battles, making their own impossible choices. But this was her fight, her family, her responsibility. The weight of leadership sat heavy on her shoulders, but she carried it with the same determination that had seen her through medical school before the world ended. The hospital doors stood ajar, darkness yawning beyond like an open mouth. Inside lay either salvation or death, and there was only one way to discover which. Kasai stepped forward into the shadows, Amara close behind, both women knowing that whatever they faced in the coming hours would test not just their survival skills, but the very bonds that held their makeshift family together. The hospital's interior was a maze of overturned gurneys and scattered medical equipment, illuminated only by the pale light filtering through grimy windows. Kasai's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing dark stains on the walls that could have been blood or something worse. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional creak of settling debris. Amara moved with practiced efficiency, her medical training guiding her toward the pharmacy despite the chaos surrounding them. She had memorized the hospital's layout during her residency rotations, never imagining she would one day navigate these halls as a scavenger rather than a healer. Her fingers traced along the wall, feeling for the familiar landmarks that would lead them to their destination. "Third floor," she whispered, pointing toward the stairwell. The pharmacy should still be intact if the military evacuation protocols were followed. They climbed carefully, testing each step before putting their full weight down. The building had taken damage during the early days of the outbreak, when desperate people had fought over resources and the military had tried to maintain quarantine zones. Bullet holes pocked the walls and entire sections of railing had been torn away, leaving dangerous gaps that could send an unwary traveler plummeting to the floors below. On the second landing they encountered their first obstacle. A zombie in a nurse's uniform stood motionless in the corner, its back turned toward them. The creature's scrubs were stained with fluids that had long since dried to a rusty brown, and its hair hung in matted clumps around its shoulders. Keisai raised her spear, but Amara caught her wrist, shaking her head slowly. "It hasn't noticed us yet," Amara breathed. "We can go around." They edged along the opposite wall, their movements deliberate and silent. The zombie remained still, swaying slightly as if listening to music only it could hear. As they passed, Keisai caught a glimpse of the creature's profile and felt her stomach lurch. She recognized the face beneath the decay, Dr. Folake, who had delivered her nephew just 2 years ago. The woman who had smiled and congratulated the family was now a hollow shell, animated by hunger and instinct. The pharmacy door hung open, its electronic lock system long since failed. Inside, most of the shelves had been stripped bare, but Amara's trained eye spotted what others had missed. She moved quickly through the remaining supplies, selecting antibiotics, pain relievers, and antiseptics with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly what each medication could accomplish. "Django will need these every 6 hours, she explained, packing the precious vials into her bag. "And if Zuberi's shoulder infection gets worse, we'll have something to fight it with." A crash echoed from somewhere below them, followed by the unmistakable sound of multiple footsteps. The infected had found their way into the building, drawn perhaps by their scent or simply by the random wandering that characterized their behavior. Keisai moved to the window, peering down at the street below where more zombies were gathering, their numbers growing by the minute. "We're trapped," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "There must be 30 of them down there now." Amara joined her at the window, her mind racing through possibilities. "The roof," she said finally. "There's a maintenance ladder that leads to the next building. If we can reach it." They gathered their supplies quickly, knowing that every second of delay increased their danger. The sounds from below were growing louder, and they could hear the distinctive shuffle drag of infected feet on the stairs. Whatever had awakened them was driving them upward with single-minded purpose. The roof access was locked, but Keisai's spear made short work of the rusted chain. They emerged into the harsh afternoon sunlight, squinting as their eyes adjusted. The city spread out before them like a vast cemetery, smoke rising from distant fires and the occasional flash of movement marking other survivors' struggles. Zuberi was waiting for them on the adjacent rooftop, her face grim with concern. "The whole district is swarming," she called across the gap. "Something's got them stirred up." The maintenance ladder was exactly where Amara remembered it, but the gap between buildings was wider than it had appeared from inside. 8 feet of empty air separated them from safety, with a 3-story drop to the alley below. Behind them, the roof access door shuddered as something heavy struck it from the other side. "I'll go first," Keisai said, slinging her pack across her shoulders. "If I don't make it." "You'll make it," Amara interrupted firmly. "We all will. We've come too far to fail now." The door burst open just as Keisai began her climb, and the first zombie stumbled onto the roof. Its milky eyes fixed on them immediately, and its mouth opened in a moan that would draw every infected creature within hearing distance. Time had run out, and their only choice was to trust in their skills and the bonds that had kept them alive this long. Keisai's hands found purchase on the ladder's rungs as the zombie's moan echoed across the rooftop, a sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. The metal was slick with moisture and rust, making each grip treacherous as she pulled herself across the gap between buildings. Below, the alley yawned like an open grave, littered with debris and the occasional glimpse of movement that suggested they weren't the only ones seeking passage through this urban wasteland. Behind her, Amara had grabbed a piece of broken concrete and hurled it at the approaching zombie, striking it in the chest and sending it stumbling backward. The impact bought them precious seconds, but more infected were already emerging from the stairwell, their collective groaning creating a symphony of hunger that made Keisai's skin crawl. "Move!" Amara shouted, following Keisai onto the ladder as the first zombie regained its footing and lurched toward them. The ladder swayed under their combined weight, bolts groaning in their moorings as the ancient maintenance equipment protested this unexpected use. Keisai forced herself not to look down, focusing instead on the rhythm of hand over hand, foot after foot, each movement bringing her closer to Zuberi's outstretched arms on the opposite rooftop. Halfway across, disaster struck. One of the ladder's support brackets gave way with a sharp crack, and the entire structure tilted at a dangerous angle. Keisai felt her stomach drop as she suddenly found herself hanging nearly upside down, her pack threatening to slide off her shoulders and take their precious medical supplies into the abyss below. "Hold on," Zuberi called, lying flat on the roof edge and reaching as far as she could. "I've got you." Amara, still on the hospital roof, watched in horror as more zombies poured through the access door. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they would overwhelm her position, but Keisai was still too far from safety. Without hesitation, she began pulling medical supplies from her own pack and hurling them at the approaching infected, using bottles of saline solution and boxes of gauze as projectiles to slow their advance. Keisai's muscles screamed in protest as she hauled herself along the tilted ladder, her fingers cramping from the desperate grip she maintained on each rung. The antibiotics for Django rattled in her pack with each movement, a constant reminder of what was at stake. She could hear Amara's labored breathing behind her, punctuated by the sound of improvised weapons striking rotting flesh. "Almost there," Zuberi encouraged, her voice tight with strain as she stretched further over the edge. "Just a little more." The final few feet felt like miles, but finally Keisai's hand closed around Zuberi's wrist, and she felt herself being pulled to safety. The moment her feet touched solid rooftop, she spun around to help Amara, who was now fighting a running battle across the damaged ladder as zombies pressed closer to the edge. One of the infected, more aggressive than the others, actually stepped onto the ladder in pursuit. The additional weight was too much for the already compromised structure, and with a grinding shriek of metal, the entire apparatus began to separate from the hospital building. Amara felt the ladder falling away beneath her and made a desperate leap, her medical bag flying open and scattering supplies into the wind. Keisai and Zuberi caught her arms just as she cleared the gap, all three women tumbling backward onto the rooftop in a tangle of limbs and equipment. For a moment, they lay there gasping, listening to the crash of the ladder hitting the alley below and the frustrated moans of the zombies now trapped on the hospital roof. The immediate danger had passed, but they all knew it was only temporary. The infected would find another way down eventually, and when they did, the hunt would resume. "Is everyone hurt?" Amara asked, pushing herself up and automatically checking her companions for injuries despite her own scraped palms and bruised ribs. Keisai inventoried their remaining supplies with growing dismay. They had lost nearly half of their medical equipment in the escape, including some of the antibiotics meant for Django. What remained would have to be carefully rationed, and there was no guarantee they would find another opportunity to resupply. Zuberi pointed toward the western edge of the building, where a fire escape offered a route to street level. "We need to move before they figure out how to get around the building," she said. "And we need to warn the others about what's happening. This wasn't random, something organized this attack." As they gathered their scattered belongings, Keisai couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation crawled along her spine like ice water, and when she glanced back toward the hospital, she could swear she saw a figure standing among the zombies on the roof. A figure that stood too straight, moved too purposefully to be one of the mindless infected. But when she looked again, there was nothing there except the familiar shambling forms of the undead, and she told herself it was just her imagination playing tricks in the aftermath of their harrowing escape. Still, the feeling lingered as they began their descent, a nagging certainty that their struggles were being observed by something far more dangerous than the zombies they had learned to evade. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the ruined city in shades of orange and red that reminded Keisai uncomfortably of fire and blood. Night would bring new dangers, and they still had miles to travel before reaching the safety of their sanctuary. The fire escape groaned under their weight as they descended into the gathering dusk, each step taking them closer to street level where new dangers waited in the shadows between abandoned vehicles. Keisai's mind raced with calculations: distance to their sanctuary, remaining daylight, the likelihood of encountering infected patrols along their route. Every variable mattered when survival hung by such thin threads. Amara paused on the second-floor landing, her medical training making her acutely aware of the sounds drifting up from the alley below. The wet, tearing noises were unmistakable, zombies feeding on something fresh. She held up a closed fist, the signal for absolute silence, and pointed downward with two fingers. At least 2 infected, possibly more. Zuberi leaned over the railing, her circus-trained balance allowing her to get a better view without making noise. What she saw made her stomach clench with revulsion and fear. 3 zombies crouched around what had once been a person, their faces buried in the carnage with the single-minded focus of predators. But it was the fourth figure that made her blood run cold, a zombie that stood upright, watching the feeding with what appeared to be calculated interest. "That's not normal behavior," she whispered, pulling back from the edge. "One of them is just observing." The implications hit all three women simultaneously. If the infected were developing hierarchy, if some were becoming leaders while others remained followers, then everything they thought they knew about survival was about to change. The mindless hordes they had learned to evade were evolving into something far more dangerous. Kasai made the decision quickly. They would have to find another route, even if it meant traveling through more dangerous territory. The antibiotics in her pack seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, a constant reminder that Django's life hung in the balance. Every delay increased the risk that they would return to find another member of their family lost to this nightmare world. They backtracked to the roof and crossed to the building's opposite side, where a narrow alley offered concealment but forced them to travel single file through a maze of overturned dumpsters and abandoned shopping carts. The smell here was overwhelming, a mixture of decay, human waste, and something else that Amara's medical knowledge identified as the distinctive odor of infection. "Someone's been living here," Zuberi observed, pointing to a makeshift shelter constructed from shopping carts and tarps. "Recently." The shelter was empty now, but signs of recent habitation were everywhere. A small fire pit still contained warm ashes, and personal belongings were scattered about as if the occupants had left in great haste. Kasai knelt beside a child's drawing that had been left behind, the crayon marks depicting a family holding hands under a bright yellow sun. The innocence of the image was heartbreaking in this world where such simple happiness had become impossible. "They left food behind," Amara noted, examining a half-eaten can of beans. "Whatever made them run, it happened fast." A low whistle echoed from the far end of the alley, followed by an answering call from somewhere behind them. The sounds were too organized, too purposeful to be random zombie vocalizations. Kasai felt the hair on her arms rise as she realized they had walked into a trap. "We're being herded," she said, her voice barely audible. "Something is coordinating them." The three women pressed themselves against the alley wall as shadows began moving at both ends of their narrow passage. The infected were approaching with deliberate slowness, cutting off escape routes with tactical precision that should have been impossible for creatures driven only by hunger. Zuberi spotted their salvation first, a drainage pipe that ran up the side of the building, wide enough for a person to climb if they were desperate enough. "There," she pointed. "It leads to the roof of the next building." But as they moved toward the pipe, a figure stepped into view at the alley's mouth. It had once been human, but the transformation had left it something else entirely. Its movements were fluid and purposeful, and when it turned its head toward them, Kasai saw intelligence burning in eyes that should have been clouded with death. "Run," she whispered, then louder as the creature began moving toward them with predatory grace. "Run." Zuberi reached the pipe first, her acrobatic training allowing her to scale the metal surface with spider-like agility. Amara followed, her medical bag bouncing against her back as she climbed with desperate determination. Kasai brought up the rear, glancing back to see the intelligent zombie directing its companions with gestures that were disturbingly human. The pipe shuddered under their combined weight, and Kasai heard the ominous sound of metal separating from concrete. Below, the infected had reached the base of the building and were beginning to climb, their movements clumsy but relentless. The intelligent one remained on the ground, watching their escape with what could only be described as calculating patience. "It's learning from us," Amara gasped as they reached the rooftop. "Studying our tactics." They ran across the building's flat surface, leaping smaller gaps between structures and using maintenance equipment to bridge larger ones. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter but never disappeared entirely. The infected were following, but at a distance that suggested they were being tracked rather than hunted. As they neared their sanctuary's neighborhood, Kasai called a halt behind a large air conditioning unit. They needed to catch their breath and plan their final approach. The building that housed their group was only 3 blocks away, but those blocks might as well have been miles if they were walking into an ambush. "Something's changed," she said, checking her weapons and supplies. "The infected are organizing, learning. We need to warn the others and start planning for a different kind of war." Amara nodded grimly, her mind already racing through the implications. If the zombies were developing intelligence and coordination, then every safe house, every escape route, every survival strategy they had developed was now potentially compromised. They were no longer fighting mindless predators but something that could think, plan, and adapt. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges that would have been beautiful in any other circumstances. Night brought its own dangers, but it also offered concealment. They would have to trust in their knowledge of the local terrain and hope that their sanctuary remained secure. As they prepared for the final sprint to safety, none of them noticed the figure watching from a distant rooftop, its enhanced vision tracking their movements with mechanical precision. The evolution of the infected was accelerating, and humanity's time as the dominant species was running shorter with each passing day. The converted apartment building that served as their sanctuary rose before them like a fortress against the dying light, its windows carefully boarded and reinforced with metal sheeting salvaged from construction sites. Keisai felt a surge of relief at the sight of the familiar structure, but it was tempered by the knowledge that nowhere was truly safe anymore. The intelligent zombie's calculating gaze haunted her thoughts, a reminder that their enemies were evolving faster than their defenses. Zuberi moved ahead to scout the building's perimeter, her movements fluid and silent as she checked for signs of intrusion. The group had established multiple entry points and escape routes, each one carefully concealed and known only to their inner circle. But if the infected were truly learning, adapting, then even their most secret passages might be compromised. Clear, Zuberi signaled from the building's rear entrance, but her expression remained troubled. Too clear. Where are the sentries? Amara's medical bag felt heavier with each step as they approached the hidden entrance behind a false wall panel. Inside those precious vials were antibiotics that could save Django's life, but first they had to reach him. The silence from within the building was ominous. Their group always maintained watch rotations and someone should have challenged their approach by now. The entrance mechanism responded to Keisai's touch, the panel sliding aside to reveal the narrow corridor that led to their main living space. But instead of the warm glow of lanterns and the quiet murmur of conversation, they were greeted by darkness and an oppressive silence that made their skin crawl. Django? Keisai called softly, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. McKenna? Asha? No response came, but as they moved deeper into the building, Amara's trained nose detected something that made her stomach clench with dread. The metallic scent of blood hung in the air, mixed with the distinctive odor of infection that she had learned to recognize in the early days of the outbreak. They found the first body in what had been their common room. Kofi, who had been their electronics expert and radio operator, lay sprawled beside his equipment with his throat torn open. But it was the precision of the wounds that made Keisai's blood run cold. These weren't the random tears of mindless feeding, but calculated strikes designed to kill quickly and efficiently. This wasn't done by ordinary infected, Amara whispered, kneeling beside the body despite the danger. The attack patterns are too sophisticated. Zuberi had moved to check the other rooms, and her sharp intake of breath drew them toward the sleeping quarters. There they found McKenna and Asha, the two women who had become the group's foragers and scouts. They had died fighting, their weapons still clutched in their hands, but they had been overwhelmed by something that fought with tactical awareness. Where's Django? Keisai asked, her voice tight with fear and growing rage. The youngest member of their group was nowhere to be found, and his absence filled her with a dread that went beyond simple concern for his safety. They searched every room, every hiding place, but found no trace of the boy whose fever had driven them to risk the hospital raid. In the group's medical station, Amara discovered signs of a struggle, overturned supplies, blood on the walls, and most ominously, drag marks leading toward the building's main entrance. They took him, she said, her voice hollow with the implications. But why? The infected don't take prisoners. The answer came in the form of a sound that chilled them to the bone, Django's voice, weak but unmistakably alive, calling from somewhere outside the building. It was a trap, obviously, but it was also a challenge they couldn't ignore. The boy was family, and family meant everything in this world where human connections had become more precious than gold. Keisai moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boarding to see the street below. What she saw there made her understand the true scope of the threat they now faced. Dozens of infected filled the street, but they weren't the shambling horde she had grown accustomed to fighting. These moved with purpose, forming organized ranks around a central figure that stood with unmistakably human posture. The intelligent zombie from the alley was there, but it was no longer alone. Others like it had emerged from the shadows, their enhanced forms showing signs of rapid evolution that defied everything science had taught about viral mutation. They were becoming something new, something that retained human intelligence while gaining the infected's immunity to pain and fear. They're using him as bait, Zuberi observed, her circus performer's eye for staging recognizing the theatrical nature of the scene below. They want us to come down. Django's voice came again, weaker this time, and Keisai felt her resolve crystallize into something harder than steel. The antibiotics in her pack could save the boy's life, but only if she could reach him. The evolved infected might be learning human tactics, but they had underestimated the bonds that held her group together. We go down, she decided, checking her weapons one final time. But we go smart. They want to study us, learn from us? Let's give them a lesson they won't forget. Amara nodded grimly, her medical knowledge already formulating plans for treating whatever injuries they might sustain in the coming fight. Zuberi flexed her fingers, preparing for the kind of performance that would either save their family or end their story entirely. Outside, the evolved infected waited with inhuman patience, their trap set and their prey cornered. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had threatened the one thing that could transform desperate survivors into something far more dangerous than any virus could create. The building's main entrance had been barricaded from the inside, but Keisai knew the infected would expect them to use one of their hidden exits. Instead, she led Amara and Zuberi to the roof, where a maintenance crane from a nearby construction site offered an unexpected route to street level. The evolved zombies might be learning human tactics, but they hadn't yet mastered the art of thinking like desperate people with nothing left to lose. From their elevated position, they could see the full scope of the trap laid out below. The intelligent infected had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the building, with Django tied to a lamppost in the center like some grotesque offering. The boy was conscious but clearly weakening, his fever-flushed face visible even from their height. Time was running out in more ways than one. There, Zuberi pointed to a gap in the infected ranks where two of the evolved zombies stood slightly apart from their companions. If we can take those two out quietly, we might be able to reach Django before they can react. Amara studied the scene with clinical detachment, her medical training helping her assess the tactical situation. The evolved ones are directing the others through some kind of chemical signaling, she observed. Look at how the regular infected respond when the leaders move. If we can disrupt that communication. Keisai was already formulating a plan that would require all their skills and more luck than they had any right to expect. The crane's boom extended far enough to reach the building across the street, and from there they could access the storm drain system that ran beneath the infected's position. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also their only chance. The descent was harrowing, with the crane's cable swaying in the evening breeze and the constant fear that their movement would attract attention from below. Zuberi went first, her acrobatic training allowing her to control the cable's motion as she rappelled toward the opposite building. Amara followed, her medical bag secured tightly to prevent any noise that might give them away. Keisai came last, her eyes never leaving Django's still form as she descended. The boy had stopped calling out, which could mean he was conserving strength or that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Either way, they had minutes rather than hours to complete their rescue. The storm drain entrance was exactly where Amara remembered it from her residency days, when she had used the underground passages to move quickly between hospital buildings. The tunnels were dark and filled with the detritus of urban decay, but they offered concealment and a route that would bring them up directly beneath the infected's position. They moved through the tunnels in single file, their flashlights creating dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The sound of dripping water masked their footsteps, but it also concealed any noise their enemies might be making above. When they reached the drainage grate beneath the street, Keisai could hear the infected moving overhead, their footsteps creating a rhythm that spoke of coordinated patrol patterns. "On my signal," she whispered, positioning herself beneath the grate while Amara and Zuberi flanked the opening. "We go up fast and hard. No hesitation, no mercy." The grate lifted silently, and Keisai emerged into the nightmare landscape of the street. Django was less than 20 feet away, but between them stood one of the evolved infected, its enhanced senses already beginning to detect their presence. She moved without thinking, her spear finding the creature's spine with surgical precision before it could alert its companions. Amara and Zuberi erupted from the drain opening like avenging spirits, their weapons finding targets with deadly efficiency. But even as they fought, Keisai could see more infected converging on their position. The evolved zombies were adapting in real time, learning from each exchange and adjusting their tactics accordingly. She reached Django just as the boy's eyes fluttered open, his fever-bright gaze focusing on her face with desperate hope. "Keisai," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're not just hunting us. They're studying us, learning to be human again." The words sent ice through her veins as she cut his bonds and pulled him to his feet. Around them, the battle was intensifying as more infected poured into the street. But these weren't the mindless hordes they had fought before. These creatures moved with purpose, using cover and coordinated attacks that spoke of rapidly developing intelligence. "The antibiotics," Django gasped as she half-carried him toward their escape route. "They took some of my blood." I think they're trying to understand the infection process. Amara appeared at their side, her medical bag open as she prepared to administer the life-saving medication. But even as she worked, her mind was racing through the implications of Django's words. If the infected were experimenting on human subjects, trying to understand their own condition, then they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple viral outbreak. "We need to go," Zuberi called from their rearguard position, her voice tight with strain. "They're learning our fighting patterns. Adapting faster than we can adjust." The retreat to the storm drain was a running battle through streets that had become a laboratory for evolution itself. Behind them, the evolved infected followed with patient determination, no longer the mindless predators they had once been but something new and terrifying in its implications for humanity's future. As they disappeared into the underground tunnels, Keisai couldn't shake the feeling that they had won this battle only to discover they were losing a much larger war. The storm drain tunnels stretched beneath the city like arteries in a vast corpse, carrying the survivors deeper into a labyrinth that had become their only refuge from the evolving nightmare above. Django's condition had stabilized after Amara administered the antibiotics, but his revelations about the infected's experiments cast a shadow over their small victory that no amount of medical success could dispel. "They're building something," Django whispered as they paused in a wider section of tunnel to rest and treat their wounds. "I saw them before they took me." The evolved ones were directing the regular infected to gather materials, electronics, medical equipment, even books. "They're trying to rebuild civilization but in their own image." Amara's hands shook slightly as she cleaned a gash on Zuberi's arm, the implications of the boy's words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Her medical training had taught her to think in terms of symptoms and treatments, but this was beyond anything in her textbooks. The infected weren't just surviving, they were evolving into something that retained human knowledge while discarding human limitations. "We need to warn the other survivor groups," Keisai said, her voice echoing in the concrete chamber. "If the infected are organizing on this scale, nowhere is safe anymore." Zuberi winced as Amara applied antiseptic to her wound, but her mind was already working through the tactical implications. "The radio equipment in our sanctuary was destroyed, but there's an emergency broadcast station in the subway tunnels about 2 miles from here. If we can reach it." The sound of splashing water from the tunnel behind them cut off her words, followed by the distinctive scraping noise of claws on concrete. The infected had found their trail and were following them into the underground passages. But these weren't the clumsy, stumbling creatures they had fought in the early days. These moved with purpose through the darkness, their enhanced senses allowing them to track prey through environments where humans struggled to navigate. "Move," Keisai ordered, helping Django to his feet despite his protests that he could walk on his own. The boy's fever had broken, but he was still weak from his ordeal and the infection that had nearly claimed his life. They ran through the tunnels with desperate urgency, their flashlight beams dancing across graffiti-covered walls and revealing glimpses of the homeless camps that had once provided shelter for the city's forgotten population. Now those same spaces served as hunting grounds for creatures that had once been human themselves. The pursuit was relentless but strangely methodical. The infected seemed content to follow at a distance, herding their prey toward some predetermined destination rather than attempting to overwhelm them through sheer numbers. It was a tactic that spoke of planning and coordination that should have been impossible for creatures driven by viral programming. "They're not trying to catch us," Amara realized as they paused at a junction where 3 tunnels converged. "They're driving us somewhere specific." The revelation hit them all simultaneously. They were being herded like cattle toward a slaughter. But unlike the mindless infected of the early outbreak, these evolved creatures understood the value of psychological warfare. They wanted their prey to understand what was happening, to feel the growing despair of a trap closing around them. Keisai studied the tunnel maps painted on the junction wall, her finger tracing possible routes while her mind calculated distances and dangers. The subway station Zuberi had mentioned lay down the central passage, but that was also the most obvious route, exactly where their pursuers would expect them to go. "The maintenance tunnels," she decided, pointing to a narrow opening barely visible behind a pile of debris. "They're too small for large groups and they connect to the old pneumatic postal system. We can use those tubes to reach the surface without being detected." The maintenance passage was a nightmare of cramped spaces and rusted pipes, forcing them to crawl single file through sections barely wide enough for their shoulders. Django's breathing was labored but steady, the antibiotics working to fight off the infection that had nearly claimed him. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the infected struggled to follow through passages designed for human maintenance workers rather than hunting packs. They emerged into a forgotten section of the city's infrastructure, where the pneumatic postal system's brass tubes still gleamed despite decades of abandonment. The tubes were just wide enough for a person to crawl through, and they connected to buildings throughout the downtown district, including the emergency broadcast station. "I'll go first," Zubri volunteered, her smaller frame making her the logical choice for reconnaissance. "If the route is clear, I'll signal from the other end." The brass tube was like traveling through the digestive system of some mechanical beast, with joints and valves creating obstacles that had to be carefully navigated. But it was also completely isolated from the infected's hunting grounds, a secret highway that their enemies couldn't access or monitor. Zubri's signal came after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. 3 sharp taps on the tube wall that meant the route was clear. One by one, they made the claustrophobic journey through the pneumatic system, emerging into the basement of a government building that had been abandoned since the early days of the outbreak. The emergency broadcast station was exactly where intelligence reports had indicated, its equipment still functional thanks to backup power systems that had continued operating long after the city's main grid had failed. But as Amara began powering up the transmission equipment, they discovered they weren't the first survivors to find this refuge. Bodies lay scattered around the radio room, but these weren't victims of zombie attacks. The wounds were precise, surgical, and the positioning of the corpses suggested they had been arranged deliberately. On the broadcast console, someone had left a message written in what appeared to be blood: "Evolution requires sacrifice." "They knew we'd come here," Django said, his voice hollow with the realization. "They've been planning this from the beginning." The darkness that enveloped the government building was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows on the walls. Outside, the evolved infected had surrounded their position with military precision, their enhanced coordination allowing them to maintain a perfect perimeter while their human prey waited in the radio room like animals in a cage. Keisai felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her shoulders as she considered their dwindling options. The antibiotics had saved Django's life, but their sanctuary was destroyed, their friends were dead, and they were trapped in a building surrounded by creatures that had transcended the simple hunger that had once defined them. The virus hadn't just reanimated the dead, it had created something new, something that retained human intelligence while discarding human limitations. "The ventilation system," Amara whispered, her medical knowledge of building layouts offering one final possibility. "The main air shaft connects to the subway tunnels. If we can reach it." But even as she spoke, they could hear the distinctive sound of metal being torn apart somewhere above them. The infected were dismantling the building's defenses with methodical efficiency, working their way down floor by floor with the patience of creatures that no longer feared time or exhaustion. Zubri moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards to assess their situation. What she saw made her blood run cold. The evolved infected weren't just surrounding the building, they were studying it, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to analyze structural weaknesses and plan their assault with engineering precision. "They're not just hunting us anymore," she reported, her voice tight with fear. "They're learning from us. Every building we've used, every tactic we've employed, they're incorporating it all into their own strategies." Django, despite his weakness, had been examining the radio equipment with the focused intensity that had made him their electronics expert. "The emergency broadcast system has a backup transmitter," he said, his fingers working quickly over the controls. "It's designed to punch through interference and reach military frequencies. If I can boost the signal." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the building's corridors, accompanied by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The evolved infected were communicating through subsonic frequencies, coordinating their assault with a sophistication that defied everything they thought they knew about viral behavior. "Whatever you're going to do it fast," Keisai said, positioning herself at the room's entrance with her makeshift spear. The weapon felt inadequate against enemies that could think and plan, but it was all she had left. Django's fingers flew over the radio controls as he rerouted power from the building's emergency systems. The backup transmitter hummed to life, its signal cutting through the infected's coordinated chanting like a knife through silk. For a moment, the building fell silent as the creatures paused to analyze this new development. "This is Django broadcasting on emergency frequency 77 Alpha," the boy spoke into the microphone, his voice steady despite the approaching danger. "The infected have evolved beyond our projections. They retain human intelligence and are coordinating across multiple regions. Recommend immediate evacuation of all urban areas and implementation of scorched earth protocols." The response came immediately, not from human survivors, but from the evolved infected themselves. Their voices filled the radio speakers in perfect harmony, speaking words that chilled the survivors to their very souls. Evolution is inevitable. Resistance is futile. Join us willingly, and your consciousness will be preserved. Amara felt her medical training rebel against the implications of those words. The infected weren't just killing and converting, they were offering a choice, a transformation that would preserve the mind while changing the body. It was seductive in its promise of immortality, terrifying in its complete abandonment of humanity. The door to the radio room exploded inward, revealing the lead evolved infected from their earlier encounters. But now it was accompanied by others like itself, their forms showing signs of rapid adaptation that spoke of accelerated evolution. They moved with fluid grace, their eyes burning with intelligence that was unmistakably human yet utterly alien. Keisai, the lead creature spoke, its voice carrying traces of the person it had once been. You have shown remarkable survival instincts. Your genetic material would be valuable to our collective. The offer hung in the air like poison, tempting in its promise of survival but horrifying in its cost. Around her, Keisai could feel her companions wavering, their exhaustion and despair making the infected's proposal seem almost reasonable. But then she thought of their fallen friends, of the children's drawings left behind in abandoned shelters, of all the small moments of humanity that had sustained them through the darkest days of the outbreak. Some things were worth more than survival. We choose to remain human, she said, raising her spear with hands that no longer trembled. Whatever that costs us. The battle that followed was brief but fierce, a final stand that would be remembered by no one except the creatures that had once been human. When it ended, the radio room fell silent except for the steady hum of the emergency transmitter, still broadcasting Django's warning to anyone who might be listening. Outside, the evolved infected began their methodical expansion across the city, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to build something new from the ruins of the old world. They had learned everything they needed from their human prey, and now they would create a civilization that transcended the limitations of mortality. But in the depths of the underground tunnels, in hidden shelters and forgotten bunkers, other survivors heard Django's final transmission and began to prepare for a different kind of war. The age of simple survival was ending, but the age of resistance was just beginning. The last light of human defiance had been extinguished, but from its ashes, something harder and more determined was already beginning to grow.